പ്രതിഭ.
പ്രതിബോധിതാം ഭഗവതാ നാരായണേന സ്വയം വ്യാസേന ഗ്രഥിതാം പുരാണമുനിനാ മധ്യേ മഹാഭാരതം അദ്വൈതാമൃതവർഷിണീം ഭഗവതീം അഷ്ടാദശാധ്യായിനീം അംബ ത്വാമനുസന്തധാമി ഭഗവദ്ഗീതേ ഭവദ്വേഷിണീം യം ബ്രഹ്മാ വരുണേന്ദ്രരുദ്രമരുത സ്തുന്വന്തി ദിവ്യൈസ്തവൈഃ വേദൈഃ സാംഗപദക്രമോപനിഷദൈഃ ഗായന്തി യം സാമഗാഃ ധ്യാനാവസ്ഥിതതദ്ഗതേന മനസാ പശ്യന്തി യം യോഗിനോ യസ്യാന്തം ന വിദുഃസുരാസുരഗണാഃ ദേവായ തസ്മൈ നമഃ. We are discussing the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. With this 6th chapter, one part of the entire text, one important section of the entire text comes to an end. At the beginning of Lord Krishna's instructions, he tried to infuse a sense of duty and obligation, propriety and righteousness of action. Then Lord Krishna taught Arjuna some fundamentals of Advaita philosophy, then explained Karma Yoga and also the science of renouncing desires and thoughts and anxieties about what we do and how to perform our day-to-day activities with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, without attachment and without any strong desire. Now, in the 6th chapter, Lord Krishna is going to elaborate the technique of meditation. So, in the 5th chapter, we should remember two types of renunciations were taught in the 5th chapter. Renunciation of our agency of action, that means kartrutva buddhi as we call in Sanskrit. When we do our work, we should not always be obsessed with our own role in that work. I am doing this, I am the one who is accomplishing all this. I mean, identifying ourselves with all that we do, identifying ourselves as the agent of action, that should be given up. That should be renounced. And then we should also renounce a strong sense of desire for enjoying the fruits of our activities, our anxieties and worries and concerns with regard to what we do or what we are doing, and losing sleep over the possible results and consequences of our actions. It becomes an invisible binding force which make life unbearable too much of anxiety and worry as to what will unfold in future. I have done, but what is going to happen? So these anxieties and worries should be given up. It should be renounced. So renunciation of agency of action and renunciation of our identity as the one who is going to enjoy or suffer the consequences of our actions. Now, how to achieve this? For that, we must make our mind ready. We must try to transcend sankalpas and vasanas, impressions and worries and concerns, negativity, skepticism, and also extreme infatuation. These are two sides of the same coin, extreme attachment and extreme dislike. They go together. Extreme aversion and extreme infatuation both go together. They're like two sides of the same coin. So that should be given up. And for that, we have to take to a course of spiritual practice, the practice of meditation. So that is a subject going to be discussed elaborately in the 6th chapter. So we just recited the first verse. Anasita karma phalam karyam karma karotiyaha sa sannyasi cha yogi cha na niraknih na cha akriyaha. Now, some of these words, when translated, may need some elaborate description. The one who performs his duty and obligation without leaning to the fruit of action, without too much of attachment to the fruits of action. He is the renouncer of actions. So, it is not the one who physically gives up his duties. It is the one who gives up, renounces his concerns, his own attachment, his own obsessive attachment to the results of what he has done. That is to be given up. Literally speaking or physically speaking, it is impossible for anyone to give up his or her duties so long as a person is living in the world physically with a moderate level of health and energy. We have to do work with our body and mind. We think, which is a kind of inferential quality. It's called anumiti or anumana. And then we see things with the pratyaksha, direct perception. So all our everyday activities, whether we like or not, from a very ordinary worldly standpoint, common sense standpoint, all these activities are inevitable. Lord Krishna makes a statement in the 3rd chapter, Nahi kasikshanamabhi jadu tishtati akarma krita. No one can remain quiet, free from all activities, physically and mentally. If you are not physically active, you'll be thinking, you'll be speculating, you'll be worrying, or you may be planning for the next course of action. So no one can really remain without any activity, physically and mentally. That is impossible. So that should be kept in mind as a background when we understand this. But here in this verse, there are certain words, niraknihi akriyaha. 2 words are used. So Lord Krishna says, he who performs his duties without desire for the results, without extreme attachment, obsessive attachment to the results of his actions, such a person is the real man of renunciation. That is the real art of renunciation. That's actually that renunciation as an idea, as an ideal, has a great place in spiritual life. It's not just for monks only, it is for householders also. Because renunciation is a symbol of our understanding that there is something higher we should care for, we should aspire for, than what we normally achieve and enjoy in this world. So we move away from these empirical things, worldly enjoyments, sense enjoyments. We move away and we go beyond and we transcend that realm of worldly enjoyments, which is actually a sign of intellectual maturity, spiritual wisdom, and that is a sign of our ability to look for something higher, something transcendental. So who is a man of renunciation? A man of renunciation is one who gives up his desire and his ego and his extreme obsessive attachment to the results and consequences of his actions. And such a person is a man of steadfast mind. It is not he who gives up rituals. So the word Agni is used here. Agni means fire. And we will understand the real technical relevance of this only when we keep in mind the fact that these Gita teachings actually took place in a culture and tradition where Vedic rituals were prevalent. So I mentioned this on many occasions. During the early stage of the evolution of Vedic civilization, religious practices consisted of performing certain rituals. And these rituals were performed by offering things in fire. There were 3 types of fire: Garhapatyagni, Ahavaniyagni, and Anvaharyagni. It's a part of the Dakshinagni. So, mostly householders used to practice these fire sacrifices. Garhapatyagni is a sacred fire which is kept intact without dying out. And after the marriage, a householder used to keep this fire intact. In certain traditions, the sacred sacrament of marriage, which had a great spiritual significance in one's life, it's an important sacrament. They used to take certain vows, what we call vratas, facing the fire. So fire was considered to be a sacred thing, and the Agni was called as the one who walks in front of us, leading us towards celestial regions where gods and angels were living. That's why Purohitam, Agnimile Purohitam Yajnasadeva Murticham Hotaram Vritnadhatamam. So that's the first mantra of Rigveda Samhita. So Agni was called Yajnavahaka, meaning the one who takes our offerings to different deities, different sages, different angels, different devas and devatas. Then there was Ahavaniya Agni, where they used to perform these, they used to perform milk, yogurt, cooked food and so on. They used to perform Agnihotra. And the third was Anvaharya Agni, where they used to cook food for the rituals in big yajnas and yagas. What it means to say, there was a belief in those days, not now, but when Gita was taught, And it is a false and wrong belief, you see, Lord Krishna is trying to correct. If you just stop doing your daily rituals, if you stop performing your Vedic rituals and sacrifices. Sacrifice here means, remember, there is not killing an animal or any kind of cruel things. What it means is offering milk, honey, yogurt, cooked grains, food, sometimes butter, all this on fire. Uttering a mantra, certain mantras, and there are a number of mantras. Varunaya Swaha, Indraya Swaha, etc. So, and it was offered to the celestial deities, the divine beings who are in control of the phenomenal world and different natural forces. That's how they considered that the highest thing that a householder should aspire for is to live a life in perfect harmony with nature, in harmony with the divine forces which are controlling the forces of nature. So many of these deities and devas and devatas were the presiding deities of different natural forces like lightning, fire, oceans, mountains, clouds, air, and so on. So Vayu, Madarishwa, Varuna, Indra, you find all these deities are mentioned in the Vedic text, canonical literature. All the teachings of the Upanishads of Bhagavad Gita evolved at a later stage in the evolution of Vedic culture. And also householders were expected to practice certain rituals which are not clearly stated in the Vedas, which are called smarta karmas, we call samskaras, sacraments. So it all began before the birth of a child. It involved giving sacred names, feeding the little newly born baby with food, giving an appropriate name, and cutting of the hair, we call, chaulam, chuda karmam, etc. And we are not going to these details. And marriage, looking after children, looking after parents, and finally death, and then burning the body in the fire as an offering, again going back to the fire god, Agni Deva. So many of these rituals were from Vedas, and many of them were not directly related to the Vedas, but they were all mentioned in the Smriti literature, which deal with the different obligations and vows of householders. And there were also 14 different types of sacrifice rituals, Vedic rituals, which involved this fire. Agnyadhanam, Agnihotram, Deshapurnamasam, Agrayanam, Chaturmasyam, Nirudha Pashubandham, Sutramani, all these, Sapta Havir Yajnaha. Means in all these Vedic rituals, they used to offer different things in the sacred fire. That's why, Lord Krishna uses the word, and Niragni is not a man of renunciation necessarily. Niragni is one who has stopped performing his Vedic rituals and say, I have renounced everything. Just by giving up rituals, external rituals, you cannot be called a man of renunciation. You cannot be called a man of supreme wisdom. So you should not give up. You should transcend them. When you transcend them, what happens is there is no physical giving up. When a child gets high grade in a primary school, he'll be promoted to the next class. He cannot just walk and sit in the next class. When he gets a very high grade, he will naturally evolve to the next stage of his education. Like that, we transcend the early part of our life scheme. So this is Sapta Havir Yajna. Then there were, Sapta Soma Yajnas. Agnishtoma, Aktitnishtoma, Uttha, Shodasi, Vajapeya, Adhiratra, Aptoryama, etc. These are some of the 14 Vedic rituals which involved offering certain things on fire. Agnaye swaha idam namama. It's not for me. I'm offering everything to the Lord Agni, who will take my offerings to different deities, different gods and goddesses, etc. So there was no concept of a creator God as a monotheistic, anthropomorphic, overall, all-knowing, all-compassionate creator. That idea was not very much evolved. It was unknown in the early part of Vedic civilization and Vedic culture. So people had a wrong notion that if they just physically give up their daily rituals, they're performing these rituals on the sacred fire, they can evolve the next stage of their life. They can become a man of renunciation. Lord Krishna says no. Actually, you do not give up. You change the way you perform your things. At one stage of our spiritual life, we may perform rituals with a strong desire to enjoy the results, the rewards, the good results of performing the rituals. And when you evolve further in spiritual life, you do not necessarily give up performing those rituals physically, but you start performing them with a different perspective. You start performing them without any desire, without any attachment, just for the purity of mind. And that's how you transcend the early part of spiritual life. So that's why Lord Krishna says, Akriya means the one who does nothing. I mean, those who give up all their duties and obligations in householder's life, social structure. Just by becoming akriya, inactive, through inaction, nobody can be called a man of renunciation. Just by non-performance of our daily Vedic rituals, no one can be called a man of renunciation. You should remember this, the niratnih is the word used, and that should be understood only in the context of the early Vedic civilization, because in those days, householders, when they become more highly evolved in spiritual life, they will start performing certain Vedic rituals for the good of humanity and also for their own good. So apart from laukika karmas, laukika karma means everyday activities like eating food, building a home, educating your children. These are laukika karmas, which no one can avoid. So beyond that, you also start performing certain sacred rituals with an eye on afterlife. Well, all the wealth, all the wonderful home, all these things one day be left behind. So I should start thinking of life after death. So they wanted to create a wealth of spiritual merits, and it's called apurva or atrishta, the spiritual merits that you derive when you perform Vedic rituals. They will call Vedic scholars and will perform certain rituals, uttering mantras. Now we should remember, those of you who may not know Sanskrit but may be interested in knowing more about this, you can read the translations of well-known authors. In fact, the Western intellectual interest in Vedic tradition began in the early part of 18th century itself. So many of the Western, mostly in those days European scholars who discover the glory and the majesty and the beauty and the charm and the integrity and the completeness and the harmony of Vedic civilization. We were struck, and you are actually coming in contact with the sublime universal spiritual culture, which is so sublime, where you fully recognize the role of nature in your own personal life. It's called rhythm. You should have a sense of perfect harmony and intimate relationship with the whole creation. If you want to live in this world peacefully, you should be in peace with your environment, with the air and water, skies and mountains, and valleys and rivers and oceans around you. So that Dev Shanti, Antariksham Shanti, Prithvi Shanti, Roshadaya Shanti, Vanaspadaya Shanti, you find these great sublime prayers in the Vedic literature. Let there be peace everywhere. So, in those days, they used to perform these Vedic rituals, and Lord Krishna says, just by withdrawing from these rituals, you are not going to gain anything sublime. So also, by neglecting your secular duties and responsibilities in everyday life, you cannot be called a man of renunciation. Now, the next verse is more emphatic on this point. Yam sannyasam prahu yogam tam vidhi pandava nahi asanyasta sankalpo yogi bhavati kaschana. So, the idea is, you should know that devotion to action, that is renunciation. And then that devotion to action, that is the essence of renunciation and yoga, cannot be achieved without giving up our thoughts and concerns about the results of actions. That's why nahi asanyasta sankalpo. Somebody who has not given up sankalpa. Sankalpa means, I am the one who has done this work, so I am responsible, I should have enjoyment, I am the doer, I am the agent of action, so I have every right to enjoy the fruits of my labor. This attachment, this invisible link, it not only binds us to action and the world, it also gives us sleepless nights. So Lord Krishna says, the real man of renunciation, real man or real woman of renunciation is one who does his or her duty with all care and attention, but without any sankalpa. So what is sankalpa? In real sense, it means you're concerned or complaints and worries and anxieties about what we are doing and about what is going to happen. Remember, it doesn't mean that we should be negligent or indifferent to what we do or what consequences may follow. Not at all. But I mean, a feeling of selfish identification with our work and extreme infatuation and obsessive attachment based on selfish desire for enjoying the fruits and results of our action, all for ourselves, without caring for others. That selfishness is what is implied here by sankalpa. So that means without giving selfishness, without giving self-orientation, no one can become a yogi and no one can become a sannyasi. No one can be called a man of renunciation and no one can be called a performer of karma yoga, because karma yoga itself means bringing this spiritual element into whatever we do every day in our life. This also should be understood in the context of Vedic civilization, because I want to give the contemporary relevance and significance of these verses, and also I want to give the historical background of many of these concepts. For example, as I mentioned, 14 types of fire rituals that the ancient Vedic sages used to perform during the early part of Vedic civilization. That is long before the huge temples emerged, long before the very concept of a anthropomorphic creator God evolved. It's long before that. And here also there is says, nahi asanyasta sankalpa yogo bhavati kaschana. What it means is, how do we give up our identification, our own attachment to what we do? So two types of karmas are mentioned here in this context from this perspective of Vedic culture. One is kamya karma, the other is nitya karmas. Kamya karmas means certain rituals that we perform in certain on certain occasions, in certain special contexts, situations. Well, the ancient Vedic sages used to believe that if you perform certain rituals, gods will be pleased. Gods here mean not G capital God, not a creator God, but mean devas and devatas, the divine forces behind this phenomenal world, so to speak. They will be happy and you will be living in perfect harmony with the external world. So on certain occasions, they used to perform certain rituals. So you find Putrakameshti, there are many Varuna Yajna, all these people used to perform different rituals, praying to different gods and goddesses and angels, devas and devatas, offering various things, uttering sacred mantras for progeny, for rains, and for long life, all this is a common practice there. So those karmas were called kamya karmas. Kama means desire. Certain Vedic rituals performed for accomplishing these certain desires is called. The other karmas called nitya karmas, which you perform every day. Sandhya Vandana, morning oblations, evening oblations, prayers and all that. Some nitya karmas, which you do every day. If you don't perform, you will incur sin. But if you perform, you will not have any special result. Such nitya karmas, daily obligatory rituals. So, what the Gita Kara, the author of the Gita, tells us is, one should not give up these duties and responsibilities. What one should do, when you give up your desire, when you give up your own attachment, your infatuation or your aversion, whatever it is, what is happening is, you start doing the same rituals with an entirely different attitude, from an entirely different perspective. It is called Ishwararpana Buddhya, means doing it with a sense of prayerfulness to God. You do everything, but mentally offer everything to God. So that's the idea behind. Or for the welfare of humanity. They used to perform all rituals, Pashyema Sharadashatam, Jivema Sharadashatam, Bruyasya Sharadashatat. I mean, let me be blessed to live in this world with all my senses like Netrendriyas, my sense of eyes, all these remain intact. Such prayers they used to utter while uttering these mantras. With very, very ordinary desire, fulfillment of ordinary desire, long life and health and so on. Nothing wrong in it. But as you evolve in spiritual life and along the path of renunciation, what happens is, you don't give up those rituals, but you continue doing them with a sense of sanctity and sacredness and surrendering the results and also your action to God. Then what happens? Those actions that performed with this prayerful attitude of offering to God will have a spiritualizing effect, a refining and purifying effect on our mind. If you do it with a selfish motive, well, we'll be already worried about the consequences. If we do as an offering to God, we'll be peace, we'll be enjoying peace and happiness and tranquility within, and that will have a purifying, a refining effect on our mind. It is called Chitta Shuddhi, purity of mind. So Shankaracharya says, the first stage in our progress is to develop this Chitta Shuddhi, purity of mind, practice of unselfishness while performing our everyday activities, both religious rituals and also everyday secular obligations. When we perform, we should have the sense of sanctity and sacredness and a prayerful attitude, offering everything, action and also their results to God. Then it will lead to Chitta Shuddhi, and the person who attains this purity of mind is called Chitta Shuddhi. That person will be able to practice meditation very naturally and very easily. Very often, when we sit for meditation, we often find all demons which are hiding in our own mind begin to emerge. Often there is a strong push against our desire to meditate. We feel a great obstacle slowly emerging in front of us when we try to meditate. We feel restless, especially the beginners. If you are watching a TV, you have no problem. You are peaceful and happy because your mind is completely dragged into those visual pictures by the senses of perception, eyes. So the five senses drag the mind completely to the visual audio objects. But when we close your eyes and try to meditate, what happens is, eyes are closed, but the sights are still visible in our mental world, and they are much more potent, much more destructive, much more disturbing. So that's because of negative samskaras which are already stored up in the mental world. They can be removed, or they can be rendered important when we practice unselfishness, when our mind becomes calm and quiet. Through the practice of unselfishness in our daily duties, in the performance of daily duties. So this practice of unselfishness, renunciation of selfishness and selfish desires, is the definition of sannyasa, renunciation, and yoga according to Lord Krishna. And then the third verse, Lord Krishna says, Arurukshor muner yogam karma karanam uchyade yugarudasya taseva shama karanam uchyade. So Aruruksho, so you find two levels of spiritual life are referred to in this verse. One is Arurukshu, means the one who is trying to enter the path of spiritual life, or the one who has entered but still evolving, progressing and moving forward. So such a person is called Arurukshu, and he is moving towards his goal of concentration, dhyana, meditation, complete, perfect meditation. He has not reached it, but he wants to reach that stage. So he is about to enter the ladder, the path of the path that takes him to perfection in meditation. He has not reached there, but is slowly evolving. Such a person is called Arurukshu. Arudha means a person who has already attained such a concentration, such a high level of meditation. So these are two types of spiritual seekers. In fact, the same person Particularly, so that's why, yoga rudasya taseva. The same person, when he reaches the highest stage, what will happen to him? So the idea is, for the man of meditation who is trying to attain purification of mind, which will enable him to meditate with perfect concentration, that person should not give up his duties. Rather, duty itself is the means, the path, the road that will take him to a state that is beyond duty. So, this is an important thing to remember. It's just like we can see the same thing happening in schools or colleges, When you work hard, if you are a primary school student, if you work very hard, then what happens? You transcend, you go beyond that particular stage of working hard with that particular lesson that is left behind. Similarly, for the beginner, the one who is struggling, who is trying to reach a level of perfect concentration in meditation, he should not give up his work. He should give up his desire for the results of his work. So karma is not given up, kama is given up. Kama means desire. That's an important point, remember. So the same person slowly will reach a point when he doesn't feel the need for any of those actions. When we reach that point, then you find that Shama actually means renunciation, withdrawal, total withdrawal from worldly pursuits. So for the beginner in spiritual life, the world itself provides an opportunity for his spiritual progress. The office place, the factory, the farms, the industrial houses where you work, whatever may be the work we are doing, in whatever life situation we are working, all these will become a theater, a place, an opportunity for us to work out our own karmas, our own, to purify our mind. That's why Swami Vivekananda mentioned the world is a gymnasium for us to work out our karmas. But at the beginning you have to do your workout in this world. You cannot run away and you cannot give up, you cannot be negligent. But you don't want to live in a gymnasium. When you attain the purpose of going to gymnasium, then you don't go there any longer. You don't take your residence in a gymnasium, so to speak. Similarly, the world itself becomes a field. It gives you an opportunity to go beyond world. That's why Arurukshor Munir Yogam Karma Karanam Uchyati. Karma normally binds us. Karma is an invisible binding cord. It binds us to the world. When we do our work, we are anxious. After the work is done, we become concerned, worried. And if the results are beyond expectation, then we become overjoyed. If we don't get the expected result, we become disappointed. So there is always something that's going to happen to our mind, depending upon the type of results. The results will bring pain or pleasure. It goes on changing. So it is a bondage. It binds you. It keeps you a prisoner in the world. But there is a way to live in the world as a free man. You need not be prisoner when you live in the world. You can live, you can be a free man, or you can try to make use of every activity you do in the world to get out of worldliness, to get out of this bondage, this prison house. What is that? Do everything, both religious rituals and also secular duties, everyday obligations, family, which normally emerge in the family scenario, family life, or social areas, different areas, people have to do different kinds of secular activities. All can be given a spiritual orientation. That's called spiritualization of the secular. All secular activities contain, they hide the potency to be turned into a spiritual, a sacred work, a sacrament. So, for the beginner, Arurukshu, the one who is struggling to attain purification of heart, the one who is struggling, he wants to reach a state of perfect meditation, but is has not attained right now. For such a person, whatever work he does, the work itself offers an opportunity, a golden opportunity for him to work out his karmas, so that using as a stepping stone, he can go to the next stage. Now, another thing. And what about the same person, after several years of hard struggle, when he has already attained that level of concentration, then what happens? Then, inaction. Shama here means renunciation or withdrawal from worldly pursuits. Then it's okay for him. But when you reach that stage of maturity, you can just automatically transcend this prison house of worldly bondages. It's not that you get out of it. You cannot stampede out. What it means, you go beyond it. It becomes a friction-free evolution. You can find this demonstrated in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Very, very wonderful example you find. Sri Ramakrishna was born with this great power of concentration. He didn't, but in his life, in a way, his life itself is a demonstration of different stages. When he first came to the Dakshineshwar temple to do puja, he was extremely careful about the various vows and traditions and conventional practices and so on. So everything was done with meticulous care and precision. But after some years of constant spiritual practice, he reached a point of complete identity with the entire world. He could see only Brahman everywhere. He could see God alone everywhere. So he could not pluck a flower, because the flower also he saw as non-different from God. Means every moment, every thought was saturated with the God idea. So he could not see or feel anything other than God everywhere. Now, when you reach that stage, you don't have to perform rituals, because your whole life itself becomes a spiritual practice. Every word becomes a sacred mantra. Every thought becomes a meditation. Every moment, your mind is completely immersed in the God idea. So Sri Ramakrishna could not any longer do the formal worship later on. It so happened. So you can find this happening. In fact, the entire Upanishad literature contains many examples of great sages and saints and mystics who are very particular, very meticulous about the performance of their duties during the early part of their spiritual evolution. But once they reach the higher level of concentration, then they couldn't see a difference between having lunch and doing puja, doing worship. Walking becomes going around the deity, the temple. Speaking becomes uttering sacred mantras. Thoughts become a kind of meditative process. The whole life gets a spiritual orientation, a spiritual color. So, this is what Lord Krishna says. For such a person, when you reach that level of called yoga arudha, the one who has already attained the yoga of the power of the concentration, that highest level of sannyasa, then what happens, the one who has attained such a concentration, then inaction, shama, becomes natural, the natural way. But shama should not be practiced by the beginner. Shama or withdrawal from worldly pursuits, from daily obligations and duties, becomes natural and proper only for those who are highly evolved. And when they do that, they don't feel any conflict. It's true in ordinary life also. When you work hard, get a degree, when you know the subject very well, then you don't feel any friction or conflict when you write about it, when you speak about it. But suddenly, from primary school, one day you go and sit in the MA class, postgraduate class, there'll be a big friction and conflict. That's so, if a person ever tries to practice withdrawal from duties and obligations before reaching this state of perfect concentration, then he is actually acting against the natural law. That will create conflicts. That's why people should not all of a sudden start sitting for meditation in solitude, in the dark, for long hours. They should not do that. People working in the office place, maybe for 15 hours, 13 hours a day, and then reaching home 10 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night, and then sitting for meditation. They should not do that all of a sudden. They should slowly lift their mind to a higher level by reading some holy books, by listening to some holy thoughts, psalms or hymns or bhajans, what you call in Sanskrit. There are very wonderful Sanskrit devotional poetry, lot of wonderful poems are there. So one should slowly lift the mind to a state of concentration. If you just sit for meditation, that meditation doesn't really become helpful because meditation is the seventh state, in the Patanjali's system of Ashtanga Yoga. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi. It's just before Samadhi. So the highest concentration or dhyana, meditation, becomes possible only after we have prepared ourselves and we have prepared our mind, our thoughts, through the practice of selfless duties, through the practice of selfless duties and responsibilities, through the practice of unselfishness, total freedom from any selfish motive. We are preparing our mind, we are sublimating our mind, we are purifying our mind, we are refining our mind. Such a mind will immediately cooperate with you when you try to meditate. So, with this we conclude today's session. We will continue our discussion next week. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Rama Krishna Arpanamastu.